Okay, so we're gonna get started with our panelists so that we don't run late, because we do obviously have a lunch that follows this last panel. I want to introduce myself again. I'm Joanne Florino. I'm the Senior Vice President for Public Policy at the Philanthropy Roundtable. When we thought about today's sessions, we designed this last session before Dave Camp's draft legislation was issued. It turns out to be very, very timely, and that's just, we're just brilliant. What can I say? So thank you, Chairman Camp. As we've been on the Hill the last year, we know that one of the arguments that we've had a very hard time with is the argument for lower rates and the simplification of the tax code that would result in those lower rates. And as we were doing a lot of work, especially on the Republican side, we certainly ran into many members who said, look, we are sympathetic to the charitable deduction, but we're really committed to tax reform for simplification and to get those rates down. And that's an argument that we have definitely had trouble countering. So what we've done today is brought two folks from very influential think tanks to talk about the argument for lower rates and a little bit of the spillover now into the actual draft that we've seen from Chairman Camp. And we are encouraging them to go for no longer than 10 minutes each, so that there will be plenty of opportunity for questions from the floor. They are not wearing their Kevlar vests, so be very, very gentle, please. So our first panelist today is Steve Moore, formerly the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, and now chief economist at the Heritage Foundation. And Steve wrote a piece for Investors Business Daily last week that suggests that maybe the Camp draft didn't go far enough in simplification. Our other panelist is Howard Husock, who's a senior policy for the Manhattan Institute in New York City. Howard is a regular columnist on philanthropy for Forbes magazine, and several of Howard's publications are on our resource table in the back. And he will be talking also about tax reform in general, the Camp draft, and then some other thoughts about perhaps unintended consequences of the kinds of things that Chairman Camp has laid out. So we're going to turn immediately to Steve Moore.
Okay. Joanne, thank you. And let me start by saying that my thoughts on this issue about tax reform and the charitable deduction are truly my own opinions and not necessarily those of Heritage. In fact, at Heritage, people have very different opinions about this, so it's an issue that gets a lot of debate even within the walls of the Heritage Foundation. By way of background, I've been involved. Oh, let me say one other thing. Thank you to all of you in this room for what you do. The foundations that you represent and the giving that you do is so important to America and to our prosperity and to helping the poor and aiding education and all of the other programs that you do. So I just wanted to salute you for everything that you do to make America a better place. So I have devoted a lot of my professional career to the issue of tax reform. I worked with Dick Armey back in the mid-1990s when I sort of first got started on this in 1993 and 1994, when many of you may recall that Dick Armey endorsed the kind of pure flat tax idea of an 18% tax rate, postcard tax return, get rid of all the deductions and loopholes, make it really simple, make it very pro-saving and investment. And I helped write that plan for Dick Armey in 1994-95, and then shortly thereafter, I got involved with a group called the Fairtax. I think probably a lot of you are aware of that organization and that movement, and that was the idea of replacing the entire income tax structure with some kind of a national sales tax, which would basically mean you would just pay your taxes when you go to the cash register, and there would be essentially no corporate income tax, no capital gains tax, no dividend tax, no estate tax, and we would simply have a sales tax, so there would be no charitable deduction because there'd be no income tax. And then I've been involved in all sorts of other variations of this. All these tax reform plans have some of the same kind of features, which is, most of them are designed to get tax rates as low as possible, number one. Number two, they try to get rid of the double taxation of saving and investment, which is a kind of punishment on the basic building blocks and ingredients to a strong and growing economy. And number three, they try to dramatically simplify the tax system so that it is less complicated and we don't have to spend $200 billion a year as Americans just figuring out how much taxes that we owe. I'm very much in favor of that. I'm a kind of purist on this. What I would favor is getting rid of all of the deductions and loopholes and carve-outs and special interest favors. And I'm not suggesting to you that the charitable deduction is some kind of special interest favor, but I do think that one of the things that I discovered having worked on tax reform for the last now 25 years is I do believe that if you're going to get rid of deductions, you have to, if you're going to have a dramatic overhaul of the tax system, I've come to the opinion you have to get rid of all the deductions. You can't say, well, we're going to have tax reform, but except we're going to keep the mortgage deduction, we're going to keep the charitable deduction, we're going to keep the state and local, because then what happens is you just get a kind of a lobbying frenzy and a free-for-all, and then you just, this tax code degenerates right back to what we have today. So then the question, of course, is why is this so important? Why is it important that we have tax reform, and why is it so important that we bring tax rates down and simplify the system? And I think the answer to that is that our economy is not doing very well right now, and it hasn't been doing as well as it should for at least the last decade. And I am a believer, and I think the evidence is pretty overwhelming on this, that if you look at the evidence over the last 100 years, there's almost no question in my mind that when tax rates are lower, the economy does better. It was certainly true. It's interesting if you look at the three big economic growth periods in the United States, the 1920s, the 1960s, 80s, and 90s, those were a period of falling tax rates. And the idea here is that when you reduce tax rates, you reduce distortions in the economy, you reward people for work and entrepreneurship and saving, and those are the things that make an economy grow. The interesting thing about this is that when tax rates have generally been lower, a few things have happened. Number one, we've gotten more growth. And by the way, just so you understand the logic behind this, sometimes it's not immediately apparent. Let's go back to, for example, the 1970s when we had a 70% tax rate. A 70% tax rate by definition means that for every additional dollar that you're earning, either as an investor or a worker or an entrepreneur, out of every dollar, 70 cents of that dollar goes to the government, and you only get to keep 30 cents. And so this is kind of a toll on work and incentives that matter. When you reduce those tax rates, you get more. There's an old saying, if you tax something, you get less of it, and if you tax something less, if you tax something, you get less of it, and if you tax something less, you get more of it. And so we certainly found the case in the 20s and 60s and 80s and 90s that lower tax rates did have an impact on impacting growth. The other interesting thing that has happened over time is if you look at with respect to the charitable deduction, when we have cut tax rates, the best kind of evidence of this is what happened in the 80s, because we cut tax rates so significantly. We had a 70% tax rate in 1980. By the end of the Reagan administration, the tax rate wasn't 70%, it was 28%. So that means that the value of all deductions, by definition, was cut by well over half, and in some cases by 2/3. So in other words, the value of taking a charitable deduction in 1980, if you were in the 70% tax rate, is you get 70 cents tax reduction every dollar you gave. At the end of the decade, you only got 28 cents of a deduction. So if the charitable deduction were the main or even an important motivation for people giving, you would have seen a reduction in charitable giving in the 80s. And in fact, we saw just the opposite. The charitable giving actually rose at a faster rate in the 1980s than virtually any other time in American history. And then you have to ask the question, why? Why is that? Because obviously, there is an incentive if you have high tax rate to devote more money to charity. But what the evidence shows very clearly on this, and many of you in this room are more experts on charitable giving motivations than I am, but as I look at the evidence, it's pretty clear that the number one motivation for giving is how the economy is doing. When people have more income, they give. When people make fortunes, they give out of that fortune. We saw a big boom in the United States economy in the 80s, partly because of those lower tax rates. And guess what? As people made more money, they gave more money to charities. So I guess I would, since I think my time is just about up, I would simply make the case that if we could have a true flat tax or some kind of a really low rate tax system with no deductions, I don't think that the evidence is very clear that charities would be hurt. And I think I would make the case to you that if we had a very vibrant economy, and by the way, one other just statistic for you all to think about. If you compare where this U.S. economy is today versus where it was at this stage of the Reagan expansion. So we've had these two different, economic philosophies under Obama and Reagan. The U.S. economy today would be $2 trillion larger. So we've had this growth deficit over the last 5 years. This has been a recovery that has been incredibly anemic. In fact, it's been the worst, as most of you know, it's been the worst recovery we've seen since the Great Depression. So you add $2 trillion to the U.S. economy, think about what that means to, well, first of all, people will need less charitable, right? There'll be less need for soup kitchens and homeless shelters and things like that because people will have jobs and they'll have incomes, which is our ultimate job, is to make people economically self-sufficient. If you spread that $2 trillion around every family in America in an equal way, that would mean every family would have $15,000 more income. Growth is the key to making Americans, not just making America a more prosperous place, but as John F. Kennedy said, I think quite profoundly, is that a rising tide really does lift all boats. And I think we should be aiming, even the charitable sector should be aiming all of our focus on how do we get America working again? How do we get this economic growth rate up so that people are less dependent on charities and more economically self-sufficient?
Thank you, Steve. Howard Husock next.
Well, thanks very much. I echo Steve's remarks in applauding this group for all that it does. And I just have to say, it's an odd position to find myself as the opposite number to somebody whose work I've admired so much over the years, and certainly the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal.
Likewise.
I am not going to argue against a dynamic American economy or the goal of the dynamism of the American economy, and certainly I'm not going to argue that we ought to raise tax rates so we could get more charitable giving. I think, and by extension, I think that those in this room ought to be thinking carefully about not casting yourselves as just one more special interest group, which the president's budget, by the way, did yesterday, if you look at his language, charitable deduction and mortgage interest deduction, as if they were the same thing. And so I think a high-minded openness to various approaches of tax reform is becoming for a public-spirited group like this. All that said, I think that it's very important for those of us who are concerned about what government does well and what should stay outside of government and is not done as well by government, to have as a goal keeping charitable giving at least steady or increase. To the extent, now Steve hinted at a model in his head, I don't know what the details of that model are, or at least the possibility that in a more dynamic economy, charitable giving would go up overall, maybe yes, maybe no. But I think that's a high standard that any tax reform plan ought to adhere to. And I would point out that a flat tax, a fair tax, a radical simplification, even if it had that virtue, I hesitate to say they're not going to be on offer anytime soon. And so it's important for us to look in this context of the goal that I just set out, which is let's hold charitable giving at least steady or increase it, no matter what the tax plan is. We basically have two plans on offer right now. And we've heard a lot about Dave Camp's plan. But I just want to remind you that for the 5th year in a row, the Obama administration has proposed to hold at 28% the value of the deduction, even as the top rate has gone up to 39.6. This is a very significant proposal. It ought to be taken very seriously. It ought to be pushed back against, in my opinion, for the following reason. We can be not sure that Dave Camp's proposal will increase charitable giving, as he asserts, and I'll get back to that in a minute, but we can be pretty darn sure that holding the deduction at 28% will decrease giving by a very significant amount. Arthur Brooks has estimated $9+ billion. I think that's a very plausible estimate. I've also noted that because high net worth donors in select states, blue states, avail themselves disproportionately of the tax, the charitable deduction, you're going to see a disproportionate effect of the Obama ceiling in the blue states. And many of our most important charitable organizations are headquartered in the blue states. So I wrote about this in a short paper for the Manhattan Institute. I talked to the Chief Development Officer of Columbia University. That's a national institution. You wouldn't think it would be tied to a certain area. But he said 54% of their annual campaign donations came from New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, all blue states. Those are all places where people itemize. Very significant. I think why the case for holding charitable contributions steady, having that be a goal of any tax reform plan. I'll say this about that. We've heard Sandra's excellent discussion in the previous panel about why charitable deduction is not a subsidy. But I also think we ought to think of it even more expansively about that. I think of it as our national social venture fund. Ideas that are creative, that are bubbling up. They can be about how to deal with the disadvantaged, but that's not the only goal of charity. The national story, as was said about the museums, I happen to like a real iconoclast in the current charitable giving world, Peter Thiel, the PayPal co-founder. Peter Thiel proposed the idea, I'll give you $100,000 not to stay in college, right? To encourage entrepreneurship. I think he profoundly changed the national conversation about the value of a college education. Since that time, we've seen a whole rethinking. Is college worth it? He sparked a national, let me just tell you, the Federal Department of Education was never going to make that offer in a million years. And in a sense, they can't, right? He's also, by the way, investing in something NASA gave up on, helping the Earth avoid collisions with asteroids. You know, I thought that was crazy till that meteor almost hit that place in central Russia. If only it had hit Vladimir Putin, but...
But I digress.
This is being taped, Howard.
I should have had that Kevlar, I guess, yeah. Anyhow, but there's a...
Now you do need that bullet.
That's right. So there's a fundamental case here, and the president's budget is inevitably going to decrease giving and ought to be held to that standard. Now, Chairman Camp's budget at least sets out the assertion that giving would be increased by $2+ billion. It's not at all clear to me, I must say, how he derives that math. Presumably because other deductions are going to be reined in, presumably because of the, as Steve said, the overall dynamic growth of the American economy, there's going to be more available for charity. But I think he ought to be held to a standard of how do you get to that $2 billion number, because I haven't seen the math on that. But let me talk for a moment about the strategic impact that one might see from really radically reducing the number of itemizers and confining the charitable deduction to just the 5% whom Chairman Camp speculates would continue to avail themselves of that deduction. I think that we're going into dangerous territory in that way for the following reason. What you're going to see is who are those who get the charitable deduction? One of the small number of remaining deductions, because Chairman Camp has laudably reined in so many of the loopholes in tax credits? Well, only the very wealthy, the super wealthy, are going to be the ones availing themselves of the charitable deduction at that point. There's going to be a big fat target on the back of that 5%, is my concern. And I think that gets us back to a conversation that the last panel began to engage, which is this very serious push that I believe, and Adam Meyerson has talked about it at the roundtable, from what I would call the intellectual left, if you will, that the deduction, and in fact the only good charity, it's not even about the deduction, the only good charity is direct services to those who are disadvantaged. And we're seeing a significant intellectual pedigree behind this idea, and I think Chairman Camp's proposal would allow that pedigree to have a target. When I say pedigree, I mean Peter Singer at Princeton, Rob Reich at Stanford. These are not insignificant institutions. This is, as Adam has said, an argument that must be taken very seriously. I call this, in a short book that I did for Encounter Press, and I think there's some copies over there, they're free. I'm not selling them. Selling them to a charitable, that'd be a bad idea. Philanthropy under fire. And this is where the fire is coming from, the idea that there's certain types of charities that are good that we can know for sure which the good ones are, and we ought to encourage them. I think a strong pushback, anybody who wants to go to Xavier Becerra's office from California, he's associated with this. You know, if the Democrats ever took back Ways and Means, he might be the chairman. This is serious business. And I'll just close with a personal note in that regard. My own father was orphaned at age 10 in South Philadelphia. He was raised by what is now the Jewish Family Service. It wasn't called that then in Philadelphia. And the activity he liked more than anything else as a young boy was to go to the Franklin Institute, the Science Museum, originally endowed by Benjamin Franklin in Philadelphia. And he became enamored of what he was learning there and was inspired to a career as an electrical engineer. Now, I don't think the Franklin Institute was giving him any hot meals, right? It wasn't explicitly giving him a lesson, but it inspired him. And that's what charity as our National Social Venture Fund can do, and any tax reform plan ought to protect it, hold it steady, or seek to increase it. Thank you very much.
Thank you both, Howard, Steve. I've got a question to start things off with. We heard in the previous presentation the distinction between the subsidy argument about the charitable deduction and then the argument that the charitable giving should not even be part of the tax base because it is money that you send away from yourself and it should not be treated as income. So the provision that charitable, if you look at the Camp draft, there is a provision in there that charitable giving would be excluded from the proposed excise tax on the wealthy. And that seems to actually suggest that there is some notion that charitable giving shouldn't be part of the income base, at least in that particular circumstance. It shouldn't be part of the base on which that 10% excise tax is calculated. So I'd like to ask both of you, what's your response to this suggestion that we've heard in this room more than 1 year, that all charitable giving, and I mean universally charitable giving, so this wouldn't be non-itemizers and itemizers alike, would be an above-the-line deduction on a tax return? Steve.
I would be against that. Look, I mean, one of the principles of a sound tax system is a broad tax base and a low tax rate. And I don't like the idea of depleting the base of the tax system. That's how you get back to what we had in the 60s when we had 90% tax rates. So I'm not attracted to that idea. One of the things I'd like just conceptually for you all to think about is that, you know, it wasn't until 1916 that the United States had an income tax in this country. And ladies and gentlemen, we had homeless shelters, we had churches, we had hospitals, we had food banks. These aren't, the tax deduction and the income tax are not, in my opinion, what drives giving. If we could have a more dynamic economy, I really truly believe you would see more money going into the charitable sector. One other quick point on this. One concern I have as an economist, and I've been looking at this data for the last 10 years, is that in the United States, the for-profit sector of the economy is shrinking relatively, and the not-for-profit sector of the economy is growing. I have a big problem with that. But by the way, profit is not a dirty word. Profit is what makes all of what you do possible. If it hadn't been for profits, there wouldn't be the foundations that, as you know, that you represent. And I am troubled by this, that so much of the economy is going into this nonprofit sector of the economy, when all of the growth and all of the things that we depend on for economic substance is coming from the for-profit sector.
Well, I certainly agree with Steve that the University of Chicago was endowed before there was an income tax or charitable deduction. Mr. Carnegie gave the money for his libraries. But we are in a different world. And it worries me that if we let the best be the enemy of the better, we're going to be left with a much bigger government than we had before the income tax that will drive out available wealth for charitable giving. And so I'm really urging I could agree with Steve in theory, but in practice, I think we're not at that point in the United States of America these days. And to the implicit point that Joanne is making, I think anything that expanded the base of potential donors who feel that it's in their tax interest to make a charitable deduction would be strategically a good idea. It might be too cute by half, and I kind of hesitate to be that strategic about the tax system. There was talk in the mid-90s about changing the deduction to a credit and make that a universal credit. And that could be modeled. It's not worth dismissing. But again, the conservative position here, I think, is incremental change, and I think we have to be careful about moving too quickly away from what we have now.